Thank you very much, Elias, for that kind introduction, and welcome to everyone who is attending this webinar. I'd also like to thank Elias for inviting me to present the first of what I understand is going to be a series of talks in psychology over the coming months. The title of my talk, Bi-Directional Effects of Anxiety on Cognition and Cognition on Anxiety. And what I'm going to try to do is just to explore some, what I think are fairly simple ideas, but they indicate some of the conflicts and differences of opinion that exist in the area. Okay, so if we consider the personality dimension of trait anxiety, relate that to consider its cognitive features, there has been a strong tendency over the last 20 years or so to focus on cognitive biases. That, as it indicates at the bottom of that slide, focusing on cognitive biases that involve specific threat-related processes. So the two most commonly investigated cognitive biases associated with anxiety are attentional bias, where people selectively attend to threat-related rather than neutral stimuli, and interpretive bias, where ambiguous stimuli, ambiguous sentences tend to be interpreted in a negative or threat-related way. Okay, so this at the moment, I would say, is kind of the dominant position, that we should be focusing on threat-related cognitive processes. Okay. In apparent contrast to that, an approach that I have been proposing for quite a long time now is based on the notion that maybe, I don't deny that there are specific threat-related cognitive processes related to anxiety, but I would also like to argue that there are more general processes and in attentional control theory that I and colleagues put forward in 2007, we argued that the most important cognitive features associated with anxiety relate to inefficient attentional control. So as you can see here, we can distinguish two forms of attentional control. One is negative attentional control, which involves a successful inhibition of the processing of distractors, task-irrelevant stimuli. So negative attentional control involves not attending to stimuli that are irrelevant to the task in hand. And on the other hand, we have positive attentional control. This relates to the ability to shift attention efficiently between and within tasks. So this is using attentional control in a positive way to make sure that processing is optimal. Okay, of course, in the real world, specific threat-related processes are important, and much more general processes such as these two kinds of attentional control are important. But I'm going to try to argue that in some ways it perhaps is more important to focus on general features such as attentional control rather than excessively on more specific kinds of processes. Okay. Right, so key experimental evidence here would be, supposing we have participants carrying out a task, but at the same time we present neutral distractors. Okay, so we're not looking to see whether people who are anxious are distracted by threatening stimuli. According to attentional control theory, anxious individuals should be distracted by completely neutral stimuli that have no threat value whatsoever. And in a series of experiments, Nazanin Durakshan and I and other people have carried out a series of studies on what's known as the anti-saccade task. Basically, in the anti-saccade task is you present a stimulus on one side, shall we say here, and that is an indication that the participant should look in the other direction. Okay, so the anti-saccade task involves not doing the natural thing, attending to the stimulus that's presented, again, a neutral stimulus, but instead looking in the opposite direction to it. And of course, according to attentional control theory, anxious individuals should find it hard to inhibit attending to a neutral, irrelevant stimulus. And what we have here is, if we just focus on the right-hand side of the slide, what we have consistently found is that anxious individuals take significantly longer to make a saccade or eye movement in the appropriate direction. In other words, their ability to attend to in the direction they have been told to attend is inhibited to some extent by poor attentional control. So there's been a whole series of studies that have found that. And another possibly more striking study, this is by Moran and Moser. What happened here was it was a visual search task where people were looking for a given target stimulus. And in one condition, there were neutral but salient distractors were present. Okay, so the task was made more difficult by the presence of irrelevant distractors, but these were neutral distractors. So according to attentional control theory, if anxious people are easily distracted, they have poor attentional control, then they should take them longer to identify the item in visual search in the presence of neutral distractors than in their absence. And so what we have here is along the bottom, this is increasing levels of trait anxiety. And on the y-axis, the other axis, we have the extent to which it took participants longer to find the target stimulus when there was distraction. And as you can see, as we move from left to right, the level of trait anxiety goes up, and the distraction cost, the lengthening in the time to find the target item, goes up. And considering that we're looking at the relationship between two very different things, I personally think it's impressive that the correlation between the two was plus 0.49. So it was essentially a correlation of 0.5 between trait anxiety and being distracted by neutral distractors, therefore showing impaired attentional control. Okay, there is a lot of research in this area, but I can categorically assure you there is a rapidly accumulating body of evidence indicating that anxious individuals have impaired attentional control, and that problems with attentional control are not limited in any shape or form to threat-related distractors. Okay, but an issue that I kind of wish that I had focused on several years ago, but it's only fairly recently that I've begun to get involved in it, And that is that, strictly speaking, the research I have been talking about so far, most of it, basically, simply all it demonstrates is an association between high levels of trait anxiety on the one hand and impaired performance due to neutral distractors on the other hand. And of course, as we all know, when you have when you only have the evidence only consists of an association between two variables, we all know that you're not supposed, well, you cannot really say what the direction of causality is with respect to it and trying to interpret the findings. Okay, so in this particular case, relating to what I've talked about so far, one possibility is that anxiety causes, in some shape or form, or influences cognitive biases, such as the ones that I mentioned, or impairs attentional control. And really the emphasis in attentional control theory was on that direction of causality, namely it was assumed, often not with particularly strong evidence, but it was assumed that anxiety leads to a variety of negative cognitive consequences consisting of cognitive biases and impaired attentional control. But of course, logically, it's entirely possible that there are the direction of causality. There could also, it could be bi-directional. The direction of causality could also be between cognitive biases or impaired attentional control, either or both of which cause increased anxiety. And as we shall see shortly, there is a fair amount of research focusing on some of that. And then finally, as I've mentioned, and if you want me to choose amongst those three, what I'm very confident is the case is that there is bi-directional causality. That is to say that anxiety influences or helps to cause cognitive biases and impaired attentional control, but it is also the case that cognitive biases and impaired attentional control also lead to enhanced anxiety. Okay, I'm not saying we've made a huge amount of progress here, but a sort of a revised theory, a revised attentional control theory that Paul Allen and I and other people are working on at the moment is based on the notion that an important part of what's going on here is what is shown in this diagram. So if we start at the top, and I should perhaps just say before going any further, we are assuming that that worry is the most important component, cognitive component of anxiety, and indeed maybe it's almost certainly the most important aspect of anxiety in any case, whether you think of just cognitive factors or not. Anyway, so anxiety, perhaps especially in the form of worry, uses up attentional resources and so provides competition for attentional resources because it requires attentional processes to focus on worry. And the competition for attentional resources caused by worry, that in turn impairs attentional control. That is to say, it makes it more difficult for anxious people to use their attention to perform a task in the way that they would like to use their attention. And then the impaired attentional control increases susceptibility to distraction, and as a result of that, makes anxious individuals more susceptible to increased worry. So what you sometimes get is, whatever they call it, sort of a negative cycle developing here, that worry causes impaired attentional control, that then leads to increased worry, and so you get a sort of a cycle developing between the two. Okay, so whether you agree with this or not, I think everyone would have to agree that this is certainly a development from attentional control theory. Whether it's true or not, of course, is another matter, but that is what is assumed there. Okay, right, and if we move on to this. Okay, so now, and this is where we're beginning to sort of develop things, we're trying to think more closely about relationships that might exist between anxiety on the one hand and attentional control on the other. And a study that hasn't attracted that much attention, but seems really important and relevant to me, is a study by Gagne et al. A few years ago as a twin study. And what they looked at was the percentage of individual differences accounted for by genetic factors. And they looked at different kinds of individual differences. So they found that individuals in attentional control were accounted for about just over 50% of individual differences in attentional control are due to genetic factors, which I think probably a lot of people think is surprisingly high. And the percentage of individual differences in anxiety accounted for by genetic factors was, it varied depending on the type of anxiety being looked at, but you can see somewhere between about 40 and 60%. And for the purposes of this talk, the crucial finding, in my opinion, is the third one. When they looked at the genetic correlation between attentional control and anxiety, they found, we see it varied a bit, but shall we say it's of the order of about -0.4. Okay, so there is a genetically determined link between high anxiety and poor attentional control, which seems quite powerful, but it certainly strengthens the argument that when we're considering anxiety and when we're considering ways of treating anxiety, that we should be paying at least some attention to attentional control, given how closely linked it seems to be, well, relatively strongly linked genetically to problems with attentional control. Okay, then we move on to the next one. Okay, here we return to what I was talking about earlier on here. Okay, it is perfectly true. There's a thriving set of research findings looking at the effects, looking at what happens when you change cognitive biases. Is it true that changing cognitive biases reduces anxiety? Clearly, if cognitive factors have an impact on anxiety, it's like cognitive biases have an impact on anxiety, then reducing or eliminating cognitive biases should lead to reduced anxiety. Okay, so there are really sort of two ways one could interpret the findings. The way the findings have generally been interpreted is that what happens with attentional bias modification is what you do, the procedure that you adopt is to focus on redirecting attention from threat-related stimuli to neutral stimuli. And so the basic idea in crude terms is that anxious people, they have developed a tendency to attend to threat-specific stimuli, and so you need to correct that specific process and get them to redirect attention away from threat. Okay, an alternative way, they may both be true, of course, but an alternative way of looking at what's happening here is maybe what happens when you train people to stop attending to threat-related stimuli that are presented to them. Maybe what is involved, at least in part, involves more general processes. So you can imagine that if you adopted procedures that led anxious people to have enhanced attentional control, if you were able to do that, you can imagine that that in and of itself might reduce the attentional bias. Okay, so of course, in the real world, it would be silly to say, well, it's got to be one or the other. There is no reason why it can't be both. Okay, but anyway, I just want to very briefly mention one or two studies that suggest that may possibly general processes could be involved here. Okay, so we move on to this one. Okay, sorry, this is perhaps a little bit complicated. Okay, so what we have here is on the left-hand side, we have, this is anxious individuals who show an attentional bias. So they attend more to the, here, they show more attention to fearful faces shown on the left than they do to happy faces shown on the right. Okay, so we've got attentional bias. And then in this particular study, what happened was that the experimenters tried what happened when they made use of a nodal transcranial direct current stimulation to a part of the brain, part of the prefrontal cortex associated with attentional control. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we've got a clear evidence of attentional bias. When TDCS was applied to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to increase attentional control, the TDCS, it has an excitatory property, so it increases attentional control. It was then found that when that was applied to the left and right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it was found that the attentional bias had disappeared. Okay, so it's possible that general attentional processes might be involved. Okay, I think I'll leave out the next one and move on to. Okay, so we've seen, I can assure you there are other studies that show similar findings to the ones I've just discussed. If you apply stimulation to bits of the brain associated with attentional control to try to increase attentional control, you typically find that attentional bias is either reduced or eliminated. So I think a reasonable conclusion is that eliminating attentional bias can depend on relatively specific attentional processes relating to threat, but it can, in addition, also relate to more general processes of enhanced attentional control generally, rather than specifically to threat-related stimuli. Okay, now in the last few years, there have been a few attempts to use sort of cognitive manipulations that arguably increase attentional control to look and see what the effects of those manipulations might be. So here we have a study a few years ago by Hadwin and Richards, who used what we could call attentional control training. The participants were given a working memory training in enhanced use of working memory, including attentional control, and they then compared the effects of such attentional control training. They compared that against CBT to see the effects on the reduction in anxious symptoms in adolescence. And the top line here, the top line here shows the effects of working memory. This is over time, as the therapy, or intervention continues. And as you can see, there's a fairly substantial reduction in anxious symptoms with those given the attentional control condition. And by and large, the effects are comparable to those with CBT. So that's just a sort of an initial study that indicates that there may be some mileage in trying to enhance attentional control in anxious individuals to improve their performance. Okay, then there was another study by Sari et al. And here what was done, there was, again, attentional control training. And the success of this attentional control training was indicated by the participants' level of what they called engagement. So in other words, the more effective the attentional control training was in enhancing performance and therefore enhancing attentional control, the greater the level of engagement. Okay, so along the bottom axis here, what we have, individuals are indicated in terms of the extent to which their attentional control increased as a result of this attentional control training. And this was in individuals who were high in trait anxiety. And then on the left-hand side, we have a measure of the beneficial effects of the attentional control training on trait anxiety, which perhaps a bit surprising. I mean, I find it a bit surprising. One would imagine that a personality dimension like trait anxiety would actually be fairly difficult to change. It's a sort of a fairly stable kind of thing. Anyway, what was found there was a correlation of plus 0.59 between the extent to which attentional control was enhanced during the process of training and the extent to which trait anxiety was reduced. Okay, again, there are some other studies, but there's not a particularly big literature on this. Anyway, so there are two studies, and I say there are a few others, suggesting that if we enhance attentional control, then we will get beneficial effects on anxiety, or reductions in anxiety. Okay, now, yeah, I want to emphasize the fact that this talk is, in some ways, this is not perhaps the ideal time to be giving the talk, given that Paul Allen and I were now sort of busily trying to pursue the sort of research agenda suggested by what I've said in the talk so far. But just to give you the flavor, the most important study that we have done so far, just sort of indicate that maybe there is some mileage in all of this. I'll just talk about it in just a second. I should perhaps say the two studies I have just talked about, I've kind of discussed them in terms of attentional control, but I'm a little bit uneasy because you could interpret the findings in slightly different ways. Clearly, there were manipulations that enhance certain aspects of cognitive functioning, but whether it was purely attentional control or not is hard to say. Anyway, hopefully just to give, at the end of the talk here, just to give you a bit of the flavor of what the future might look like. This was a study that Paul Allen and I and Morgenstern at Roehampton University being carried out. Okay, so what we did here, I think the essence is not too complicated. What we did was we used neurofeedback training. So if you look at the top figure here, that's the sort of thing that that the participants saw on their screen. And they were given the instruction, try to move the gauge up the screen. That's all they were told to do. It was as vague as that. They weren't told how they were supposed to do that. They were simply told, try to move the gauge up the screen. and what was being looked for, what moved the gauge with this neurofeedback training was what we were looking for is what is a keynote of attentional control. People who are exerting good attentional control show high levels of activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is shown on here. I don't know if you can see that, but on the second slide, on the right-hand side, it's the one that's offset from the center is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So what you find is that high levels of attentional control are represented by high activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and good connectivity between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the other area picked out in red, which is the anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, so strong activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex connecting strongly to the anterior cingulate cortex. This is, if you like, appears to be perhaps the main signature indicative in terms of brain activation and connectivity is the main indication that we have that there is good attentional control. Okay, so in other words, even if you're lost in some of the details, the key notion is that what happened was the participants got positive feedback whenever they successfully influenced their own brain activation to produce high attentional control consisting of high activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and good connectivity between that area and the anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, so that was, so this is in my opinion, this is in some ways quite different to the other research I was talking about, because here we are trying explicitly to manipulate attentional control rather than sort of manipulating it in a rather indirect fashion. Okay, so what we have here, we have the control condition, which was just a sham condition where it was impossible. There was no, the feedback was just sort of random. There was no link between brain activation and the feedback people got. The experimental condition is the one that I was just talking about, where they did get positive feedback when their brain activation suggested enhanced attentional control. Okay, and what we have here, we have an anxiety score. So you can see the ones in green, that's the control group. The sham condition, unsurprisingly, showed no change in anxiety level whatsoever. In contrast, the experimental group in the purple here, who showed a nicely significant reduction in anxiety level as a result of the neurofeedback. Okay, so neurofeedback explicitly designed to enhance attentional control proved to be successful in reducing anxiety as was predicted. Sure, this is just one study. Paul Allen and I are sort of pursuing this line of research, but this is the first real outcome from our attempt to try to demonstrate that if you enhance attentional control, this should be really useful for reducing anxiety in all kinds of people. Okay, and here's another slide. I almost...
Mike, a gentle reminder that you've got 5 more minutes.
Yeah, I only have one more slide after this. So
okay,
a pretty long time. Okay, okay. Sorry if this slide is possibly a little bit confusing. Okay, but what we have here is along here. What we have is along on the left-hand side down the bottom here. What we have is this shows increased connectivity between those 2 key brain regions as a function of positive feedback. Okay, so as we move from left to right, we're dealing with individuals who showed more and more greater and greater increase in attentional control. And on the left-hand side, we have the anxiety score. And as you can see, there's not a massive reduction, but the line goes downwards between the two. Okay, so since time is about to run out, I'll move on to the final sort of summary slide. Okay, so really that slide just indicates another way of looking at the data, but with the same message that when brain activity indicates enhanced attentional control, you get reduced anxiety. Okay, so just to summarize in a couple of minutes or so, I'm very happy to acknowledge that anxiety is influenced by specific threat-related processes, so long as it's also accepted that general cognitive processes, especially attentional control, also influence anxiety levels. Okay, my recommendation would be the way things are shaping up, that interventions should increase their focus on general processes. And in that twin study I mentioned earlier, there was quite strong evidence that those susceptible to a range of anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessional compulsive disorder, and social anxiety disorder all have impaired control. And I would like to think that neurofeedback may in the future prove to be a very promising technique for enhancing attentional control. And just perhaps sort of leaving the main theme of this, but many of you I'm sure will know that there's been a shift within CBT in the treatment of anxiety, a shift to looking at more general processes. So David Barlow in the States is particularly associated with the development of transdiagnostic CBT. The idea is that instead of looking at treating each anxiety disorder as if it was completely separate from all other anxiety disorders, there may be general processes and general interventions that can benefit all anxiety disorders. So Barlow, excuse me, has increasingly moved in the direction of having group treatment that involves patients with a variety of different anxiety disorders. Okay, so Barlow is clearly, he doesn't focus on attentional control, but he's clearly moving in the direction of focusing on more general processes being important. And so, for example, in his transdiagnostic CBT, he's focusing on general processes common to most anxiety disorders. And so he's focused on things like reducing negative reappraisal of situations, thinking that the probability and costs of feared events are much higher than they actually are, and also reducing a general factor such as emotional avoidance. If my watch is correct, I've been going for exactly 40 minutes, which is what I was told was the maximum I could, so I will stop at that point, and thank you very much for your patience in listening to me. I suppose given the way that Zoom meetings are set up, you had little option but to be patient and couldn't perhaps interrupt. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.